So we're here tonight
Good.
to talk about change. And so change is a big topic. And so I'm really looking forward to our jam on change. And, I think we'd start with, we're coaches, for our day jobs. So we're dealing with people's change and transformation each and every session. So we see this all of the time. And from a human behavior perspective, it's a really interesting phenomenon, change. Some people are more change resistant. Some people are more change inviting. And so, for the audience who's listening tonight, we hope this conversation is really helpful in terms of your approach to changing yourself and others as well. And so it might be helpful for you to start as a listener, if you're listening, to, just check in with yourself and see where you are on the change spectrum. Do you like change, or are you a little bit change resistant? And maybe just to inquire in yourself, where did that start and what's that about for you? How have you formed your perspective on change? And as we go through this podcast interview, I'm going to be asking Anita a few questions. And for the audience, if you can, listen in and follow the cues, check in for yourself. What's your experience of change? I think we'll have a good session. You okay with this, Anita?
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So, I think let's start with the change resistance piece. People who might be a little resistant to change. Sometimes the change can be forced upon us from outside. Sometimes the conditions inside, in our psyche and our experience of ourselves could force us to want to change. It's kind of more the growth angle. I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about the dynamics of, how do you know that it's time to, either accept the situation as it is, or it's time for you to actually mobilize and make some sort of a change? How does that question sit for you? It's a big question. We could go many places.
Yeah. Well, I think that would be obviously down to the individual and a trust in whatever we're choosing in that moment, and a reflection, I think, in those moments of looking at whether it's to do with, if we're resisting the change, is it because we're really resisting the change in what's happening in those circumstances, or are we simply being run, not so simply, but by our programming of a resistance to change? So I think there's, a big part of this is, as these situations arise, is inquiring into ourselves what is actually true for us. And I think with a lot of this stuff, it's kind of delving into the patterns and the programs that we run and starting to realize that a lot of the time a lot of people will be making decisions not necessarily based on maybe so much as what's true for them versus what they're used to doing. So whether it's jumping in with change when they're maybe not really thinking about it too much, or they're avoiding, change because that's their program. And this all comes down to our kind of safety, our survival needs. Is it safer to stay as we are, or is it safer to move, to change? And there can be quite extremities within that. So I think if we've got one way that we go more than the other, and we're, that's our constant, then there's possibly some sort of, habitual response that's driving it rather than a choice response of whether we move or we don't move.
Yeah, I really love that. I really love that. Sometimes often what I can see, and I've seen in myself as well before, there might be a problem or something that's agitating me or triggering me or whatever the case is, and I'll make a change, and, it might be a surface level change. And, lo and behold, 30 days down the line, 60 days down the line, that change itself comes undone, or it wasn't the right thing to actually change. And, I've noticed in myself that, when I look a little bit deeper, it's because I haven't got to that root pattern that's really creating the conditions in the first place. And so, the deep aspect of the work hasn't been done. I haven't looked at what beliefs I've held or assumptions I've made or presuppositions that have been running. And I've just assumed things to be a certain way when they may not be that way. And so you can make the wrong surface level change and wonder why you're not getting anywhere. And also with the resistance to change, if you don't know what the root cause of that resistance to change is, you'll never really be able to fix your resistance to change or evolve at the pace that you could as a human being. So yeah, I love what
Mm.
you've shared. Like, it's so important to get down
Mm.
to the depths. And then I'd
Yeah,
add
yeah,
to it
yeah.
also, to understand the shadow of everything, because we can't really know that the change is going to be effective unless we can see the parts of us that we're denying, the darker side of us, or the shadow parts of us. Is there anything you want to say
So
on the
what
shadow?
would an example be of that? What would you give as an example in case people don't know what shadow is?
Yeah. So I guess, and this comes into it when we're talking about change in relation to others. So, if we're in a relationship with someone, doesn't matter whether it's family or intimate or friends or at work. And, often we can walk around saying, if only they'd change.
Yes. Okay.
This is a classic
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
just to link it into our last couple of weeks, we've talked about being misunderstood or feeling misunderstood, and, maybe the experience of feeling gaslighted. There's been a couple of the things we've covered in the last couple of weeks. Sometimes we can want people out there to change. And that's always ultimately on behalf of our own benefit. And
Mhm.
it's because we haven't accepted, reality or the other person as they are. And so it's a really complex kind of moral situation that we'll unpack, as we
Mhm.
go.
Mm.
But I'll keep it really simple for the moment. Any part of another person that we want to change, regardless of whether it's for a positive or a not so positive intention, that is coming from our shadow. And so that's the bullet truth there. And that can be really hard for people to hear. Wanting another person to change comes from our shadow. And
And I would
often,
add to that more kind of that need, because I think it's important to differentiate for people. So you can see someone really suffering and you can want for them to have something different. So this isn't
yeah,
to take away from that, right? So
yes,
the differentiation part is the part where we get triggered and we need them to change to the point where we're telling them what we need to be different. And that's the differentiation, because we can want people to change and be different, but we're not necessarily telling them that or trying to change them in any way. The shadow aspect comes in when it's a bit more strong and I'm telling you what you need to do. You need to sort yourself out. And it can seem like it's, some sort of care thing that we're doing, and we believe that it is from a care perspective. But what we need to look at within those situations is, do I need them to change so that I feel better? Is it actually about me and actually not really as much about them, even though we can think that we're being really caring with them? If we actually sit with ourselves and really have a look into it, who really am I doing this for? And a lot of the time when it's coming from that triggered place, that's when that shadow aspect comes in. And that's the part of us that actually, if we could change, then actually we may be able to accept them in all of their shit, in all of the way that they are. We don't have to hang around with them, but we're not trying to change them in order to satisfy something within us.
right. Yeah, cool. Totally agree.
Yeah.
And so this is, I guess, where the acceptance part of it comes in. You may
Mm.
see, a person that you're in some sort of relating with in any of those domains or contexts that we were talking about. And, you may feel desire or urge or need to point out their flaws, their limitations, their imperfections, their stuff, their trauma, their this, their that. And, as you have the propensity to do that, the first thing you want to check in with for yourself is, can I accept myself in the face of another? Is it okay for me that they're that way? Because if you can't, that is your shadow. And if you can, that's the best move that you can make, because then whatever your action is going to come from a genuinely neutral, healthy, loving, compassionate point of view. And chances are it'll be received that way too. And so this is what I see a lot in, the coaching of relationships, that we do and that I've experienced. Most people come into, relationship difficulties because they can't accept, parts of the other. And the move that they haven't made first is accepting their own discomfort accepting their own triggers, accepting their own limitations, accepting their own faults, accepting their own failings. And, if we don't have it on both sides, that there's really not much potential for the relationship to be sustainably enduring. And like you said, I really love what you said, because, having people point out in a loving way what your shortcomings are is possibly the best gift you could ever receive, because we can't see all of ourselves. We probably never will be able to. And so,
and that's where it comes from, intention. So if someone is coming to you in a more loving way, less triggered way, then, and their intention is for the best of you, then that's where it's, potentially it's not the shadow aspect. It's someone, offering you something. And even though it can seem maybe harsh at times for people, it doesn't mean that other person is doing it with intention. And that's always a fine line as well, because someone can see it as you're just doing that because you're being, nasty or whatever. But the intention of the other person isn't actually to be nasty. It is genuinely to try and help them to see something. And that's, again, where you can offer something. And if the person isn't hearing it, then someone that's quite healthy will offer it, and then they'll leave it. They've had pushback on it, and they can see, right, okay, that's not been received in the way that, maybe I'd hoped it would be received for their sake. But because I'm no longer triggered by it, I can just take a back seat now and back off. And I've put it out there if they want to do something about it, and I will still love them regardless. But when we keep on with something, when it's kind of more persistent, that's when it's probably more about you and actually not about you trying to help them or point something out or show them something. So there's quite a lot of nuances and intricacies. And I think, it's always checking in, is what is my intention for sharing this with that person? Is it because I want them to change so that I feel better? Or is there genuinely something within me that can see something that maybe they can't? And if I offer it to them and they don't like it, I can still back off and choose what I do with, whether I don't see them or whether I accept them, and just, allow them to do whatever they're doing. And I think, a big example of that would be literally someone who, someone that is very close to you, and say they've got some habits that aren't necessarily, in your opinion, serving them very well. They're taking drugs, let's say, maybe they're smoking, they're eating too much, whatever it is. And you are constantly on them that they need to change. And it's like just looking at it going, what am I really doing this for? Versus having a conversation with them, offering them something, letting them know you care, and then backing off if that's not what they want to hear, but still loving them. And I think that's, that's the differentiation.
Yeah, I love that bit that you've just shared. And then just to specifically, hone in on the misunderstanding, the space in between two people, where the intentions are not always 100% clear. And, we're using language to describe things sometimes that are just hard to, communicate through language. It makes it difficult. And I, to your point, I think that most of the times this is way less about ill intent. I don't think people are running around for the most part with ill intent for anyone else, unless relationships are broken down to such a point that it has just become, resentment. But for the most part, I think people have got healthy intentions. And just as humans, we struggle with change sometimes. It's hard. It's not easy. And so I wonder what you'd say about, I know you've often said, a little bit about permission as being a really powerful frame for oneself. I wonder if you'd like to talk in a little bit about, giving yourself permission either to make a change or permission to recognize that change can be hard at sometimes, and just to have some compassion for yourself. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can do. I think what can happen for people is that they may start to, get quite judgmental. Let's go with self first. If they're not making changes that they're telling themselves that they should be making in their life, that they shouldn't be doing this and they should be doing something else, and they're not making that change, one of the biggest blockers that will stop that change from happening is our own judgment and the harshness on ourselves, because there's clearly something that's happening in that dynamic that's keeping us in those unhealthy habits. And the more that we're then judging those unhealthy habits and we're not making the change, the more we're in pain, the more we may need those unhealthy habits to keep us kind of, actually giving ourselves some pleasure in those moments, even though we're telling ourselves we shouldn't do it. So a big part of actually, making change is to accept the current reality that we're in, stop resisting the choices we're making, and be okay with it. And then we'll go, but we can't do that, because if we do that, we're not going to make the changes that we're telling ourselves that we need in our lives. But then we keep on in the loop of this frustration with ourselves and this judgment. The minute we can just go, okay, let's just relax. And then what the change actually is it's the internal change. That's the most important change. I'm now changing the way that I talk to myself, rather than trying to judge my way into doing something different. I'm actually going to have compassion for myself, understand myself for making the unhealthy choices that I'm making, and then see what happens as a result of that. So even though the external thing isn't changing, the fact that the internal self-talk is changing is actually the most important factor. That's really where the change. So often we can think we need to change things outside of us, environmentally, with other people, in order for things to be better. But actually it's the inside, ideally, that needs to change. And the minute we can change really the way that we talk to ourselves, the more beneficial that is going to be for that external change to happen. And that can seem, for many people, quite like that. Just, I've had so many clients say no, they really want to focus on external goals, and they're like, this is a waste of time. This is a waste of time. Watching myself talk is a waste of time, blah blah blah. I need to see change. And people can really misunderstand that it's this, the minute the self-talk starts to change, it's just that's everything. That's like the number one thing that will evoke that external change and make it clear whether we actually want the external change, or it's just telling ourselves that that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, really good share. Love it. Why do you think acceptance is so hard for some people, and giving self permission is so hard for some people?
Because it's not how we're taught to be. So the human condition, as far as we've known it, is to judge our way into doing things better, being more good. In order to change, we need to judge ourselves. So the reason it's difficult is because of the way that we have been programmed from a young age. So had we come into the world and been born into a world where it was all about compassion and giving yourself permission and allowing yourself to do whatever you wanted to do, I mean, you couldn't even imagine that being, it's coming, it's definitely coming, a bit more than it used to in the old days. We can see with kids, people are, being different. The system is changing, the schooling system. There's more, mindfulness, let's say, being brought in at a younger age. So had we been born into a world where compassion and permission were the standard, then it would be easy for us to do that. But what's more true is the way that we've been raised in a world of judgment. So that's what we've been programmed ourselves with. So it's, of course, it's a change. It's a massive change that we need to start to make. And also, if you're sitting there and you're just, you're smoking every day, and, everyone around you's judging you for how much you smoke, and, you're judging yourself, to sit there and then go, I'm just going to give myself permission to do that. And people are going to be saying, you can't be smoking. Why you're killing yourself? And you're going, no, I'm just giving myself, it's for a lot of people, they're not going to feel comfortable. You've got to be pretty strong within yourself to be able to be like, not peer pressured by people around you in society. It takes a very, I don't know, very few people that can just stand in it and just go, no, I'm doing this, and this is what I'm choosing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I like that. I just reflecting as you were talking, I don't think I'd ever heard this concept of giving yourself permission until about 3 years ago. In some of the coach training.
Mine was about 7-8 years ago. Yeah, same, of course.
It's quite mind-boggling, isn't it? And when we introduce that nugget of wisdom to clients, that generally there's light bulbs that go off everywhere.
Resistance, I would say, mostly comes first, rather than people going, oh yeah, I'm really going to do that. My experience with myself when it was first said to me, when in a coaching session years ago, was, no, I'm not going to change if I just give myself permission. I just need, just be nice to myself. Things aren't going to move. And when I actually allowed myself to do it and give myself permission and start being kinder, so much changed. There was massive change. But for most of us, it's ridiculous. Like, you don't go to school and get taught to, to just be kind and have a little relax and not do your homework and do all of that. It's like, you got to do it. You got to, you got to do well. You got to be better, and you get in trouble if you don't.
Right.
So, it would be a new concept for sure.
Yeah. That's true. Um, I wonder if there's something to explore just in terms of, with acceptance and permission. When does it sort of become just resignation, like and an uncaring about what's going on? Do you have any thoughts on that? And does it?
I would only say it was a resignation if there's judgment running, which means it's not being done properly.
Right.
And I think that a lot of people, when they hear the concept of acceptance and permission, will maybe see that as a resignation, because they can't ever imagine that it could be any other way. And so it's like, if someone is just truly, they've had enough and they're truly just done and they just want to have a lie down on the sofa, some people may judge that as recognition. And that may be someone, some really high performers, high achievers may see it as that. But if that person can genuinely just resign themselves to not doing a lot for a period until they get better, then that's absolutely fine. But the minute they're resigning themselves to it and they're judging themselves for it, then they haven't, that's not the point of this. So It's like, there's nothing wrong with the resignation of it. It's clearly would be needed in those moments, but it doesn't mean that it's forever. So I think there's the difference of, if there's judgment running with resignation, then that you're not in acceptance and permission, and that's the difference.
Yeah, I'd agree. Resignation to me is almost like learned helplessness. It's a feeling of, I've got no agency in what's happening in my reality. And so, I would sort of say that if you're feeling like you're helpless in a situation, chances are you're not, for the most part. And you might be just, dipping into learned helplessness, and that's not really acceptance.
No.
I think what we're talking about in terms of acceptance, you've done it really well. It's really understanding reality as closely as it is, and particularly, as you were saying, your internal, meaning making systems as closely as you can. And
I'll be looking at the self-talk. If there's harsh self-talk running, that's not what we're talking about here. If we're allowing ourselves to rest and whatever, then that's there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's once the negative stuff starts coming that we've got something to look at there. Because often people can go, oh no, I'm not being hard on myself, and dig around enough, and they actually are. They're not getting off that sofa because there's a lot of judgment running. They're not truly just allowing themselves to rest from a restful place. Because normally when we do that, there'll be something that will move us eventually. We'll start to feel better and have more energy. If we're kind of, at that place, then we'll still be running, no doubt, some negative self-talk.
Yeah, for sure. And then if we just flip back to, relations with others for a moment, and we consider, the parts that we've explored just here in terms of, acceptance, potentially resignation, et cetera, permission. When do you think it can slip into, enabling, let's say, harmful behaviors? Because there are some situations that people get themselves into, where they're with a person who could be damaging, mentally, emotionally, physically, even. And sometimes, there can be, I guess, an enablement of those harmful patterns just by accepting those harmful patterns as okay. So it can work in that way too.
So what would an example be of that?
Well, I think some people, if you take a look at, let's say, Stockholm syndrome, that's a classic example. Where the victim of a traumatic sort of crime actually learns to love their abuser, and so they've kind of accepted, that's their reality. And in fact, they can get to a point where that's comfortable and safe because it's what's known. And and so
there's the choice. And I know it sounds harsh, but there's the choice. So it's two people enabling each other, and it seems like one's worse than the other, but the other one's still getting something from it. And if that is their acceptance piece, then that's what it is. So yeah, that's two people at probably a kind of, a less healthy ego place, less
Mm.
healthy stage of development, of developmental psychology, that have come together. So
Mm.
it's very common. It will be very common. And
Yeah.
yeah, they're enabling each other in their traumas. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about on the topic of change or acceptance?
No,
Before
I
we move
think that's.
towards the end of our time today.
No, I think I'm good. Unless you want to add anything.
No, I think it's just a sort of a big statement. Let's say change is hard.
Yeah.
Change is hard, and so there's a variety of tools to go about navigating change. All of them, as you've said, is the best way to approach it is by going inside. Not looking to the exterior to change first. Go inside. Have a look at your own meaning making systems. Have a look at your own self talk, as you were saying. Like we always say, I guess. Start there, and decide. Is the change necessary? What beliefs and assumptions and perspectives are holding me back from making that change at the deepest level that you can get to? If you've got someone that can hold space and witness with you, that's the most amazing gift you could ever have. Someone that can see the
Mm.
parts of yourself that you don't see, and reflect those back to you in a healthy, loving way. I mean, I think personally they're the most beautiful relationships that the person can ever have. They want the best for you. They want your potential. They've got the right intentions. They've got compassionate, loving heart. If you can find those people in your life, they're amazing, and they can really help you see your potential, and help you change. So I think that's kind of the headline, and always first in change is accepting reality the way it is, because you're only going to suffer yourself if you don't accept reality the way it is, and from that place of
And the
acceptance,
way that you're creating it as well. So I
creating
think that can be the massive conflict, is that part of, as I said earlier, it's like I should be doing this,
it. Mm,
but I'm actually doing this, but I should be doing that. And in that moment, it's kind of resisting the choices that we're making because we're judging them, but we're making them. So it's the
yeah,
recognition of what am I actually benefiting from in making this? And people go, nothing. I shouldn't be doing this. I should be doing that. It's like, well, the more that you can accept the reality that you're creating and choosing, the easier it may be to change it once you can, be more accepting and loving. And I think there's the thing to also, to really know, if you are someone that is looking to change someone, then if you're watching this and you can see that there's a lot of, people in your life, or there's one particular person in your life that you want to be different, there's an opportunity here, and they're not changing or whatever, is to start to look at what is it within me that I'm not happy with in this situation, and what is it within me that I want change. Because I'll often say this to clients. I'll say, they'll be talking about someone, and I'll say to them, what is it that you would like to be different for you? They're not going to change, but what do you want it to be? And they'll always try and go to, well, they just need to. And it's like, no, 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 they're not changing. They are absolutely 100% not. They are as they are. What do you want for yourself? And they'll go, well, I'd like to be less frustrated around them. I'd like to feel more calm. I'd like to be, well,
yeah,
how can you do that for yourself? They're not changing. How can you do that for yourself?
yeah,
And then it's kind of like, that's when the thinking starts. It can be really confronting to hear that, because we want them to be different because they're doing all these things to me or whatever. It's like, well, how do I need to now start perceiving, or how am I choosing now to start perceiving them differently, to maybe communicate with them differently, to see that the power was always within me. And as much as, they change or they don't change, my stuff ain't going anywhere. Even if I get them to change, I'm only going to run into the next person that I'm going to want to change, because they're bringing up the same stuff that person did. And I managed to control them to change, but this is not working so well on this side. And that's it.
like
It's just
whack-a-mole.
really paying attention to that. Exactly. So it's like, what do you want for yourself, and look to making that change within you.
Yeah,
And yeah, that might be that you don't speak to them anymore. You might not have them in your life anymore. And that's all very well. But don't forget to address the part that's triggering you about them. Because again, the next person shows up with the same personality traits, and you just keep going and going and going, and you're either going to keep separating yourself from everyone, or trying to change them and just getting annoyed. So
yeah, beautiful. And I think the final thing that I'd sort of say is that with anyone that you're relating with, whether they do or don't change, misses the ultimate point, and that is just to love people for who they are as best you can.
So love yourself first, and that will be the easy
first,
part, right?
Yeah,
because it's easier said than done, right, with any of this. But if you, it starts with us always. So the more that we can be okay within ourselves, the less we're going to need anyone else to be different. So love you, right? Love that within you.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you so much for tonight. It's a good interview. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom, and look forward to seeing the audience and seeing yourself next week. So keep well during the week.
Happy birthday in your change day. Hope you're not resisting that reality.
There was just a teeny little bit of resistance earlier. Thanks, Anita.